Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today you will get to hear Chapter 17 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. Chapter 17 is called Narcissist. Here we go. Funny thing, just about every time Van Halen walked off the stage during the 1984 tour, David would lean into the microphone and bid the band's adoring fans farewell with the following message. Thank you, insert city's name. See you in 1985. This was a false promise. There would be no 1985. Not for David Lee Roth, not for me, and not for Van Halen as we knew it. The North American tour ended in mid-July with 3 consecutive shows at Reunion Arena in Dallas. On the last night, David insisted that the show close with a massive number of balloons falling from the rafters. The rest of the guys in the band thought this was stupid. And I agreed with them. It felt like something you'd see at a sporting event or a pop concert, not a Van Halen show. But it was so exhausting to fight with David that the rest of the band simply let him have his way. I mean, really, if David wanted to turn the concert into something resembling a giant children's birthday party, then let him. Unfortunately, a technical glitch temporarily obstructed the balloons' release. By the time they fluttered to the arena floor, most of the crowd had exited the building. In retrospect, this was a fitting coda for Van Halen, despite the millions of records sold, and the still brilliant stage show. There were massive problems behind the scenes, and no amount of superficial gimmickry, whether it be a few thousand balloons or an MTV Lost Weekend with the Van Halen contest that drew more than 1 million entries, could make things right. We took a month off after Dallas before embarking on the final, brief leg of the 1984 tour. 5 dates on the Monsters of Rock tour in Great Britain, Sweden, Switzerland, and Germany. Playing alongside heavy metal and hard rock icons such as AC/DC and Ozzy Osbourne, and a hot newcomer, Motley Crue. In theory, this should have been a great way to finish up the biggest tour in Van Halen history, celebrating the band's most successful album. In reality, it was something else entirely. A bitter and sad slog to the finish line by a band that was breaking apart. The trouble began before we even got on the plane. And by plane, I mean the Concorde. We were all excited about taking the supersonic jet to London. It was a nice perk for the final portion of the tour, and felt well earned. My hope was that it would put everyone in a better frame of mind. Just a handful of shows, a nice European trip spread out over a couple weeks. It should have been easy. As I climbed into the limo with Jan and David bound for the airport, I was even somewhat optimistic. But it only took a few minutes for David to spoil the mood. Hey Noel, he said, pulling a small cassette recorder out of his carry-on bag. I want you to hear something. David was a fan of all kinds of music, and was fond of putting together mixtapes, so I figured he just wanted me to hear an artist he liked. But no, that wasn't it at all. As he hit the play button, I looked at Jan. What I heard sounded vaguely familiar. A cover version of a song I recognized but couldn't quite place. And then it hit me. California Girls. The intro sounded like a virtual mimic of the Beach Boys standard, but when the vocal track kicked in, there was no mistaking the singer. Diamond Dave. I say that not as a compliment, but as an acknowledgement that this version of the song, plodding, treacly, perfectly fit the nickname. It was not the David Lee Roth who howled, I live my life like there's no tomorrow. Or even the Dave who could infuse covers of You Really Got Me and Pretty Woman with enough muscle and energy and sex appeal to make them sound like Van Halen songs. Those were covers that simultaneously paid tribute to and in some ways improved upon the originals. But this was an abomination! I looked at Dave. He smiled and bobbed his head in time with the music. He mouthed the words along with his own vocals. What the? My assumption, at first, was that David had decided to record a cover of California Girls and then present it to the band as an option for the next album. But he had to have known that the song was an unlikely choice for a Van Halen cover, and that this interpretation, cheeky, kitschy, almost over the top in its silliness, was completely inappropriate for Van Halen. Edward and Alex would laugh him out of the room for even suggesting such a thing. And David knew it, which is why he had no intention of offering it to the band. Oh no. David had other plans for California Girls and for his own career. What do you think? Pretty great, huh? Well, David, I began, it's interesting. I'm just not exactly sure what to make of it. You really think the other guys will go for this? No, I do not, he said with a laugh. That's why I'm going to put it out myself. There was a long pause as we both let this hang in the air. I finally asked David what he meant, and he went on to explain that he had already recorded demos of a few covers, and as soon as the tour ended, he would be going into the studio with Ted Templeman to put together an EP. He had it all mapped out, and he expected me to be happy for him. I was his manager after all, just as I was the manager of each member of Van Halen. If David had aspirations for a solo career, then I was supposed to help him achieve those goals. Or so he thought, anyway. But I did not shake his hand or pat him on the back, because I did not view this as a smart or considerate career move. I viewed it as a selfish and short-sighted self-indulgence, one that would not only set David on the path to becoming a Vegas lounge singer, but would inevitably crush the soul of Van Halen. If David put out an album, or even just an EP, in early 1985 as he planned, then what would become of Van Halen? There would be no new album. There would be no tour. David would be in one place focusing on his solo endeavors, and the Van Halen brothers would be in another doing whatever they were doing, plotting Dave's expulsion in all likelihood. But here was David, sitting next to me in a limo, preparing for the final leg of Van Halen's biggest tour, and he seemed utterly clueless as to the devastation he was about to wreak on the band and everyone involved. We're hoping to get it out in January, he said with a big smile. What do you say? What do I say? I say you're a idiot. What came out of my mouth, however, was a much more benign and measured response. Really? January? David nodded proudly. And when are you going to tell the other guys about this? I asked. Soon as we get on the plane, he said. I think they'll be excited. Oh, I'm sure they will be. They were not excited. I watched from my seat in the Concord lounge as David pulled out his cassette recorder and queued up California Girls for Edward. I could not hear their conversation as they were a few seats away, but I could hear the music and read the body language. David smiling and bobbing his head rhythmically, clearly proud to share the news of this next phase of his professional life with his bandmates. And Edward slouched in his seat, staring straight ahead, his face devoid of emotion. Now this is precisely what I would have expected, and I have no idea why David would have anticipated a more gracious or enthusiastic response. Had this been a suggestion for a Van Halen song, I'm sure Edward would have shot it down. But this was not a collegial overture. Whether he realized it or not, This was David's telling his partner in essence, I'm going off in a different direction, and if you don't like it, well, you. And Edward clearly didn't like it. There had been little communication between them in recent months, their interaction limited for the most part to their time on stage, when they could feign a sort of brotherhood for 2 hours in order to put on a great show and give the fans their money's worth. I never stopped admiring that aspect of Van Halen. No matter how uncomfortable the interpersonal dynamics became, no matter how much they abused alcohol and drugs before, during, and after the show, these guys somehow held it together when they went on stage. With only a few minor exceptions, almost all of which would have gone unnoticed by the casual observer, their concerts were nearly flawless. At the very least, they always provided the non-stop energy and party for which they had become famous. Honestly, given the substance abuse had recently exiled their bass player, and their lead guitarist and lead vocalist could barely stand to be in the same room together, I don't know how they survived for the duration of the tour. But the truly curious thing was the way David presented his new venture. It was almost as if he didn't comprehend the weight of what he was doing. When you are the front man for a band as big as Van Halen, and you suddenly decide to put out a solo EP, which would be followed naturally by a full album, without consulting your bandmates ahead of time, the news is likely to be met with something less than wholehearted approval. And yet, David didn't seem to understand this, or maybe he just didn't care. Maybe this was his way of driving a nail into the Van Halen coffin. Rather than quit, he would release a solo album of aggressively mediocre material, bask in the spotlight on his own, and wait for his bandmates' response. I honestly have no idea what he was thinking, or whether he had any sort of strategy in mind. Regardless, we embarked on the Monsters of Rock tour with this bizarre and distressing bit of news hanging over our heads. But if you saw Van Halen play at Donington Park on August 18th, you never would have known that anything was wrong. This was Van Halen's first UK performance since 1980, and they made the most of the opportunity, upstaging headliners and Australian heavy metal stalwarts AC/DC. In my opinion anyway, and I wasn't alone. The band took the stage at sunset and proceeded to blow away a raucous and deeply inebriated crowd of some 65,000 spectators, most of whom had been camped out for days. Multi-act festivals are challenging under the best of circumstances. By definition, they cater to a broad audience with divided loyalties, and Monsters of Rock was about as hardcore as any festival we played. When you share a bill with AC/DC, Motley Crue, and Ozzy Osbourne, you'd better bring your A game. And Van Halen surely did, ripping through 16 songs in a little more than an hour, simultaneously playing to their fans and deftly rebuffing the not unexpected hostility exhibited from some corners of the crowd. Some AC/DC fans, after all, were sure to view Van Halen as posers, prissy California pop rock lightweights when compared to the heavier sound of the Aussies. This, of course, would have been inaccurate, and Van Halen was more than up to the challenge, not just from a musical standpoint, but from an attitude standpoint. When a young lady near the stage flicked her tongue out at David, he replied sassily, "Don't stick your tongue out at me, honey, unless you intend to use it." Or when an empty bottle of something was hurled toward the stage, "Throw another bottle up here and I'll come down there and your girlfriend." This was David at his best, a wise-assed, hyperactive vocalist who atoned for limited range with spectacular stage presence and energy. And even now, in what would prove to be his final lap with the first iteration of Van Halen, he still had the swagger and showmanship of a rock and roll superstar. He knew how to tuck away the anger and resentment for a couple hours each night and give the people what they wanted. I was hugely disappointed and frustrated by David in that last month, but I remained impressed by his ability to keep one important thing in mind: the place, the thing. Not that David would have recognized the line, or could distinguish Hamlet from a ham sandwich, but he understood it intrinsically, and that was something. It just wasn't enough. Fans saw only the show, and they thought Van Halen was the tightest band in the world, on and off the stage. They weren't there when Edward was hanging out backstage with Neil Schon of Journey, ungraciously noting that Michael Anthony's solo, which the crowd loved, despite the fact that he had ripped his pants in the middle of it, had been composed and spoon-fed to the bassist by Edward. "I had to teach him that," Edward said, "every note." Nor were they around to see Edward's meltdown in the dressing room after their set, provoked by a guitar glitch during the show. Valerie Bertinelli had been so frightened by the outburst, and I mean legitimately concerned for her own safety, that she sought out Jan for comfort and advice. Jan found me, and I went to the dressing room to calm Edward down. No easy task, given that he was up and drunk off his butt. Unbeknownst to fans, this sort of damage control had become not just part of the job with Van Halen, but in fact, most of the job. We had a couple days off after the Donington Park show. Again, for the most part, we were a family divided. Although we all stayed in the same hotel, we didn't socialize much together, unless we had to. Valerie was with Edward. There was also Alex's new wife, Kelly, whose sister was married to a guy in the music management business. This was a problem for me, as I would later discover. And I was with Jan. That left David, as always, on his own, which was a problem. As an example, one night, there was a knock on the door. Jan answered to find David standing in the hallway, looking lonely and bored. "Hey guys," he said, "want to smoke a joint?" "Not really," Jan replied. She hated smoking weed. Even if it was the most common thing in the world, it simply didn't agree with her. David pulled a pre-rolled one out of his pocket, held it up to his nose, and inhaled lovingly. Then walked into the room, though he hadn't been invited in. "No," he said, looking my way. "No thanks, David. Not tonight." He shrugged, pulled up a chair, and laughed. "Well then, I guess you can just watch while I smoke alone. That okay?" This was David at his most annoying, but also his most vulnerable. There was something sad and needy about the way he would inject himself into situations where he wasn't necessarily wanted, and about the way he was unable to form a relationship that could span more than a few weeks. But just as you'd work up some compassion for David, he'd start behaving like an egotistical, and you'd understand why he was always alone. Although it was, by comparison, a rather trivial and benign encounter, this particular night has stuck with me over the years as a prime example not only of David's roaring narcissism, but of his tone deafness, not from a musical standpoint, but in terms of interpersonal relations. David spent a few hours in our room that night, regaling us with stories that we had heard dozens of times, but that he expected would provoke laughter or approval. He positioned himself for most of the evening in a chair that faced a mirror. I do not believe that this was an accident, as David's affection for his own reflection, by now, bordered on the pathological. And so, as he told his stories and took drags on a joint, he would periodically pause and vamp for himself in the mirror, lowering his eyes, sucking in his cheeks, giggling in a come-hither manner. "I'm hungry," David said at one point. "Let's order some food." He called Eddie Anderson and asked him to run out to an Indian restaurant and bring something back. I protested, to no avail. "David, no offense intended, but I'm not a big fan of Indian food. Can we get something else?" He waved a hand dismissively. Nah, you'll love it. Trust me. I looked at Jan. She shook her head and tried not to laugh. This was David in a nutshell. It wasn't like I had never tried Indian food. For sake, I had traveled around the world multiple times. Of course I had tried Indian food. I knew what I liked and did not like. None of this mattered to David. He was, as always, unconcerned with anyone but himself. And so, like weary subjects before a clueless and arrogant emperor, we sat in my hotel room all night eating terrible Indian food. Jan actually got sick from it and stayed away from Indian food for many years afterward, listening to stale stories and watching David, stoned out of his gourd, fall in love with his own reflection. It was tedious. It was sad. It was intrinsically weird. It was old, and it made me realize how close we were to the end. We were with the Monsters of Rock tours that invaded Sweden and Switzerland and finally Germany. There was a show in Karlsruhe on September 1st and then on September 2nd in Nuremberg, which would turn out to be the last live performance by the original Van Halen lineup. And what an appropriately creepy and depressing venue it was. The sprawling Zeppelin Field complex was a place of enormous historical significance and weight. Originally named in the early part of the 20th century after Ferdinand von Zeppelin landed one of his dirigibles on the grounds, the Zeppelin Field was redesigned and expanded a few decades later by Albert Speer, the favorite architect of Adolf Hitler. The complex included a stadium that could seat nearly 200,000 people. We played at a newer stadium on the same grounds, but the original stadium was still there, although not in great shape, and the sense of history that permeated the grounds was palpable. The place was so acoustically perfect that you could imagine every word being heard from the podium without much amplification at all. And yet, knowing the substance of those speeches and the impact on the entire world and the waves of death they inspired, it was hard not to be both moved and deeply saddened. There was nothing special about that last show, aside from the fact that it was indeed the last show. Had the band known that it was such an important milestone, maybe they would have done things differently. Then again, maybe not. As it happened, Van Halen churned through another superlative set, giving no indication that the end was near. Well, almost no indication. The band's final song was a cover of Happy Trails, a song Van Halen rarely performed live, but one that could not have been more appropriate under the circumstances. There was David at the edge of the stage, his hair matted and his face glistening with sweat, growling out the final verse as the band played on. Happy trails to you, until we meet again. Happy trails to you, keep smiling until then. The following day, we boarded a luxury tour bus bound for Paris, where we would pick up our return flight home. It was a long, meandering ride through the lovely and scenic Black Forest of southwestern Germany. But what I mostly remember about that trip was the lack of euphoria and camaraderie that accompanied it. We were all tired. Tired of the travel, tired of the tour, tired of each other. The trip home at the end of a tour usually feels celebratory. This time, I was filled with resignation. At some point on that endless bus ride, David sat down next to me and Jan. He had been drinking and smoking, and immediately began holding court, talking a mile a minute, repeating old stories, all to the accompaniment of a Motown mixtape on his cassette recorder. Of everyone on the bus, David at that moment was probably in the least foul mood. He was looking forward to getting home and working on the mixing and promotion of his EP. He wanted to talk about it in great detail, but he had no interest in talking about Van Halen and what the future might hold for the band that had brought him wealth and fame. As the bus rolled on, David began drinking harder and faster. He smoked more weed. There was coke all over the bus, and David partook of this too. Eventually, and predictably, his mood began to sour. He got mean and nasty toward everyone on the bus, from his bandmates to the crew. Jane and I eventually made our escape and peeled off to a different section of the bus, leaving David talking to himself. Eventually, he fell asleep. A short time later, Jane informed me that she had to use the bathroom. Having already seen the lavatory, I warned her against it. "It's broken," I said. "There's everywhere. Believe me, you don't want to go in there. If you can hold on a little longer, I'll make sure the driver stops in the next town and you can find a clean ladies' room." But this was a tall order, for the distance between villages in the Black Forest can be extreme. At some point, Jane made her way to the bathroom, with the hope that maybe the situation wasn't quite as dire as she had been led to believe. This was a mistake. As she got to the back of the bus, she noticed that the door was partially opened, and inside she could see the figure of a man on his hands and knees. That man was David Lee Roth. Drunk, stoned, and no doubt riddled by motion sickness and bus fumes, David's head was deep in the bowl, transfixed by the horror. Jane watched as David vomited into the toilet bowl that had already overflowed repeatedly. With his hands braced against the rim, his back rising and falling, with each spasm of retching, he let his hair fall into the foulness of it all. It went on like this for what must have seemed like an eternity. Finally, she turned and walked away. When she sat down next to me, her face was ashen. "What's wrong?" I asked. "David is in the bathroom getting sick," she said, "and I don't feel so good myself." More than 30 years later, Jane will sometimes still cringe at the memory of that incident, at the sight of one of rock's most famous and glamorous vocalists puking into a clogged toilet bowl in the back of a bus. "I can't get that image out of my head," she will say. "How long before it goes away?" My guess would be forever. Well, that's the end of chapter 17. We're almost done with the book. There's only one chapter left. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.